Is Bitcoin big? Of course, when people ask that question, what they really want to ask is, have I missed the boat? And a bit later on in this video, we're going to find out. I think one of the main reasons that people have this question so often is quite simply that Bitcoin has had such a strong rise in price. I mean, Bitcoin's huge already, right? Just look at how much its price has increased in the past decade. Well, sure, its price has increased a lot in the past decade, but when you start at zero, any increase technically leaves you infinitely bigger, because of the inescapable fact that 1 is always going to be infinitely larger than 0. So of course, Bitcoin feels huge to most people already. But that was true when it was at £5, and it's still true today at £24,000. So how big is big? Bitcoin feels big because where it started was comparatively small. The key word there being comparatively. You cannot describe the size of something in a vacuum. It requires comparison. Without context, the size of anything cannot be described. You may say, well, you could use inches, but then the inches become the context. For instance, buildings are big compared to humans, so we say they're big, but it doesn't always make sense to measure the height of something in humans because, well, for one, humans are a varied group of heights. So we create rulers, standardized measurements, centimeters, inches, dollars, pounds. Most people wouldn't put those final two in that same list, but they really should, and in this video we're going to explain exactly why, because it will help us figure out the size of Bitcoin. See, money is one of those standardized measurements, one of those rulers. Instead of standardizing the quantification of physical size, it standardizes the quantification of value, something that's much more ethereal and harder to grasp. However, there is a key difference between the two, in that inches are infinite. There is no finite amount of inches by which you can measure the size of things, but money is not infinite. So in a sense, we can categorize standardized measurements into two categories. Finite measurements, where the units by which you measure a certain thing are finite, you can only have a certain number of them, and then infinite measurements, such as inches and meters and centimeters and whatnot. Now, money measures value, and when you think of value, you picture something that is in practice finite, because we'll only ever be able to create a certain amount of value as a species. But due to the fact that it's subjective, there's no theoretical limit on the amount of value that can be created. But here's where it gets really interesting, because when you're measuring something that is infinite against something that is finite, like money, the finite measurement must expand and contract to accommodate for the totality of all that's being measured against it. And if all that's being measured against it is growing, then so too must the measurement. For instance, this plant is about this many centimeters tall. If it were to get 3 centimeters taller, nobody would be running around in a panic, thinking that we have no way of quantifying the extra height because there's a shortage of inches going around. There is no shortage of inches by which to measure its new size. Conversely, suppose the supply of all the money in the world is £10, and all of the value in the world is just 10 apples. So you have 10 apples and £10. Assuming that the apples are relatively fungible, then you can assume that 1 apple is £1 worth of value, and you have £10. It's a nice, neat fit. But what if, by some way of magic, somebody manages to grow another apple? Well, now you have 11 apples, but you still only have £10. But since that's the only money you have, and the apples are the only value that you have, now the £10 is worth 11 apples. It has to be, because the purpose of the pounds is to measure all the value, and the value just increased, but the pounds didn't. So now the pounds have to stretch to fit the new amount of value. This all relates back to how big Bitcoin is, so I follows. Bitcoin is a finite standardized unit of account for value, just like money. Bitcoin is money. However, it's only accommodating for a small portion of global value, and this is for the same reason that it once accommodated no value at all. People haven't caught on yet. Right, that was a lot of weird sentences. Quick recap. If the world only used one form of money, by definition that money would have to account for all the value in the world. It sounds funny, but it's just the logical equivalent of saying, if you only use one tool to measure X, it must measure X. And if you only had one form of money to hold all of the value, then it must hold all of the value. But there's not only one tool to measure value, there's many. Each country has its own, roughly speaking, and they're all divisible by different amounts. In the same way that meter-long rulers are divisible into 100 centimeters, and foot-long rulers are divisible into 12 inches. The United States dollar is divisible into trillions of dollars, etc. So instead of thinking of these individual currency units, the dollar or £1, as independent instances of that form of money, be it the pound or the dollar or whatnot, instead consider the entirety of all units as the single instance of that form of money, and it has a size equal to the total value that it accounts for. Now you can think of the individual units of that currency as markers along the way, sort of like inch markings along a foot-long ruler, or centimeter markings along a meter ruler. Now there are many different forms of money and they all have very different sizes, and they're all competing for the same value, in a sense, with the United States dollar currently being far in the lead. Side note, by the way, this makes it way easier to understand how silly inflation is. Like, adding more markers to a meter-long ruler won't make the ruler any longer just because you said that they were centimeters. Because, well, they're not. This is where the whole term fiat money comes from. Fiat means by decree, or in other words, because I said so. The issuers of additional units of money, or the money printers, or even more accurately, the money dividers, since they're dividing the total into smaller pieces, they say by decree that the additional divisions are just the same size as the old ones that were there before they started adding more marks, and they say that this is the case because they said so. This is what makes fiat money fiat. It's valuable because someone said so, rather than something like gold or Bitcoin or many commodities which have organic demand. People just want it. You don't have to try and tell them that they do, which I'm getting sidetracked again. But as the US dollar depegged from gold, this was a massive effort of the United States government to try and convince everybody, including other countries who were confident that their dollars had value because they were tied up in gold, that they didn't really want the gold. What they actually wanted was the small pieces of paper. It was a genuine effort. They had to try and say by decree, you like these pieces of paper, don't you? Now we're keeping your gold. Anyway, tangent over. As these various forms of money that we were talking about earlier grow in size, they account for larger and larger portions of global value, and they've all been at it for quite some time now. Bitcoin, however, has existed for much less time and has had much less time to grow. So how much value does the entirety of Bitcoin account for today? Well, about $790 billion. For some comparison, because big numbers mean nothing to me either, global GDP, the yearly value production of the world in 2021, was roughly $96 trillion. This is total Bitcoin value, stood next to the value produced in 2021 alone. When you put Bitcoin in the context of its price history, of course, it looks huge. Just as when you compare the size of a human to the single cell that they began as, they are huge as well. But that's the thing, to come into existence they had to start at zero. Zero is the entry door from the non-existent to the existent. You wouldn't call a baby tall, even though they've grown a million times taller than they once were. And much like a baby, Bitcoin has also grown exponentially. But when you put Bitcoin on the stage that it's set to play in, it's quite literally the size of an ant. Anyway, I think the question, this damn wobbly plant. I think the question, how big can Bitcoin get, essentially just comes down to framing. If you see Bitcoin as a tech startup that's gone from zero to £24,000 in 14 years, you're probably going to believe that Bitcoin is huge and that you've missed the boat. But if you see it as a new competitive form of global money, well, then you're just about as early as it gets. And if you know anything about Bitcoin at all, you'll know that the former makes absolutely no sense. But you can make a very strong case for the latter. And just to get this straight, Bitcoin is not a tech startup. It's not a legal entity, it has no CEO, it pays no dividends, and there's nobody on earth who could single-handedly screw it up. This is never the case for startups. Bitcoin may be a new competitive form of global money. I mean, at the end of the day, it is the properties of money, given life through code, and it's showing no signs of failure. So, I guess, yeah, in summary, just take another look at the size comparison, and you should get a slightly better idea of roughly how big Bitcoin actually is, with some context that actually fits the picture. Anyway, that's just about it. It was a bit of a different one this week. If you didn't know, we make videos like this every single week. We'll be tackling a different topic around Bitcoin, trying to explain it in a new and interesting way. As per usual, if you think anything that I said in this video is stupid, please leave me a comment down below. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you next week. Oh, and happy Easter.